Hello and welcome to week 6 of Pub 502. I'm glad you're here on board with us. This week we will be talking about leadership and motivation, and embedded within that, we will be talking about cultural competency, bias, and privilege as elements of leadership and motivation, and more broadly, public sector management. So, with that, let's dive in and get started. So, one of the things that I had you read and consider involved how you incentivize people to work better. And I think maybe a broader discussion of motivation is appropriate here. For those of you who had me for Pub 593 last year, you'll know that we read Maslow's um, work on motivation and hierarchy of needs. And those of you in 593 this year, I think there might be one of you, will be doing that very soon as well. You may have read it elsewhere, been introduced to it elsewhere. But broadly speaking, what we're talking about is the idea that there are basic needs, there are psychological needs, and then there are self fulfillment needs, and that you work up through this hierarchy or through this pyramid in the picture, and many times it's depicted as a pyramid. As an individual, depending on the needs that you are able to fulfill. And the higher up you are, it means the more needs you're able to fulfill at a basic level. Ultimately, the goal of leadership is to motivate people to perform. And that is a very broad statement, but what you want to do is to be able to motivate those around you and especially those under you in a hierarchy or in an organization to help achieve the goals of the organization. So, broadly, as a leader, you need to be thinking about not just how do you get people to do certain tasks, although that certainly is part of it, but how you can motivate people. And one of the ways in which you motivate people is by ensuring that their needs are met. And the higher they are up on that hierarchy, the better chance that they will be performing at a peak capacity that meets their needs, but also the needs of the organization and you as a manager. So when you are an individual, just leaving management out of this, you can see that there are some basic needs. The first of those are physiological: food, water, warmth, rest. Those are the basic functions that the human body has that need to be achieved on a daily basis. The next step up from that is physical security and safety. And you'll notice that there's a bit of a jump from kind of the basic bare minimum to slightly above that. Theoretically, we can do without safety and security for a brief moment, but we cannot do without all of our physiological needs for very long at all. Then there come the psychological needs, this idea of belongingness and love, that you belong to groups, whether it's friend groups, intimate relations, or in the case of a workplace, that you actually belong in the workplace, and an affinity towards the workplace. The next step up from that, once you are able to achieve the belongingness and love, is esteem. The idea that you feel accomplishment and prestige from all of the steps below that. And then finally, Maslow says there's self actualization, that once you have achieved all of these things, you can work on actually achieving your full potential. And that is where you want to, as a leader, bring bring yourself up to, but also bring people up to that you are leading in an organization. Now, when you're a leader might not mean when you're the boss. In fact, I would argue, and I think we have at least one book on the book reviews that argues, that leading from behind is quite common. That you actually might have to lead your boss or supervise your boss in many ways. So leadership is not necessarily limited to those in charge, but is certainly open to others as well. So I wanted to go through with some a bit of detail, a little bit about Perry et al. Motivating employees in a new governance era. And again, like some of our previous readings, this is an overview of kind of the state of research on how you motivate public employees. So we can broadly lump what they have discussed, I think for our purposes, into four categories. They have a different diagram that is really more suited to researchers, and I would love to talk about that if you want to. But purely from a practice standpoint, there's kind of four main things they talk about. The first is financial incentives. And they talk about how financial incentives are theoretically used for reinforcement of good behavior or performance. And they're predicated on this notion that there are functional consequences, and that functional consequences of acting or inacting, and that you can put an incentive in there as an intervention to reinforce good behavior. There is evidence that in certain contexts this improves task performance, certainly in manufacturing organizations, higher outputs, etc. But there are some caveats to that, right? The first is that you need to incorporate feedback into this as well, that you can't just merely give a financial incentive and not explain why you're giving it and kind of debrief. But also the notion that public organizations may lack the resources to fully implement um, financial incentives in any meaningful way. This might be because they don't have the resources to do it, but also it might mean that there's something a little more complicated about public employment that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes here. The next is job design. Job design is the notion that you incorporate certain things called satisfiers that are linked to personal growth and work settings. This might mean affording employees a sense of challenge or accomplishment. It might mean providing tasks that are rich in significance and importance. And it might mean meaningfulness of work increases, and therefore you get increased outcomes. And so they talk about job redesign as a way to reduce turnover and absenteeism and to increase satisfaction and commitment. And job redesign, when you include these satisfiers, has been shown to be fairly influential in output. It actually, in some ways, may be more influential than financial or other types of behavioral incentives because it is longer lasting and there is a sense of commitment in the relationship. Then we have participation. This one's kind of hard to define, and I don't think the reading does a good job of it. So participation is the next of these. And ultimately what we're talking about here is engaging employees in their own destiny as employees and as members of an organization. So this has different buzzwords that surround it, like participatory management, employee empowerment, and various levels of commitment from different organizations. But at its core, it's a very intentional effort to provide a way in which employees can engage in kind of a role outside of their role for even lower level employees. And whether this means explaining your job to others in a way that provides meaning, maybe to the public in a way that provides meaning, or actually being involved in management decisions in various ways, being consulted, maybe being on different committees and task forces. This has been shown to increase attachment to organizations, that there is less turnover, that people have more affinity, and that if we're talking about hierarchy of needs, that you might actually get from esteem to self-actualization. But it is not necessarily linked to large outcomes in performance. The last of these, I think, and then we'll tie this all together, starts to show us ways in which public organizations might have better ways to maneuver the job experience to achieve high performance and high attachment, and that is through goal setting. Goal setting is a theory that says that if we are given conscious, well-specified goals, that this positively affects our actions as employees. This is the dominant theory in management studies, certainly in public management, and it has been shown to increase individual, group, and work unit performance. However, there's a lot of caveat here. You have a lot of caveats here, rather. You have to do this well. You have to do it intentionally. You have to do it well, and you have to follow up and keep it going. Otherwise, goal setting will fall apart. So here are some key things that you need. First, you have to have clear goals that do not contradict one another. You have to have a way in which learning goals are set in terms of larger projects. If you have a larger goal, right, you want someone to complete a larger goal, then you commit to smaller goals within there called learning goals that make it more effective for people to kind of achieve along the way. Because setting large unattainable goals may actually decrease performance when you don't implement some sort of marginal goal setting within there. Goals increase performance most strongly when employees are committed to the goals, right? So there's buy-in from the employee or employees themselves, and they receive incentives and feedback related to their achievement along the way. Which means if they receive incentives and feedback, their job is structured in a way that allows them to perform the goals, and they are allowed to participate in some way. We're actually incorporating a lot of these things all into one. Now, of course, goal setting may face some unique challenges in the public sector that the reading points out. First is that public service motivation is complex. The reason why a lot of people get involved in public sector work is far more complex than why people get involved in for-profit work. And so messing with that dynamic has pros and cons to it, right? If you are incentivized by helping others, introducing a financial incentive that is linked to a goal might actually disempower people and make them feel like achieving the goal is kind of cheap or gimmicky in a way. Also, there are weak links in public sector employment between performance and pay. It's just the case that pay is usually controlled by very political, very bureaucratic means, and so actually implementing meaningful incentives are just not there. And finally, procedural constraints may exist, that lower the perception of an ability to achieve or be recognized for achieving goals. In other words, if the ladder is so short as to only incorporate a couple of job categories, your ability to feel like you've actually made a difference, that you actually are moving up in the hierarchy, and that you are important and integral to the work being done is far more difficult in public sector employment, which tends to be fairly flat and develops horizontally, rather than for-profit employment, which develops more vertically. I think many of you may have seen that we're talking about cultural competency today and thought, why are we including it here? And that's one of the first things I want to talk about. It is my belief, and it is well studied, that you cannot lead and motivate others without fully understanding your own place in the world and understanding where they may be coming from. So while at first blush it might appear to be a little incongruent to be studying leadership and motivation and then taking kind of what seems like a quick left turn into bias and privilege, they're actually quite complementary, and I would argue necessary for understanding your role as a leader and within organizations just more broadly. So cultural competency is important to public sector managers in almost a heightened sense, because you are dealing with the public who has different levels of cultural competency themselves. But also you are dealing with people who have needs. Ultimately, the public service sector exists to provide for people's needs. And so understanding that needs may differ and experiences with the system may differ is integral, absolutely integral to public sector management. Because low cultural competency of public sector managers, and I would argue managers more broadly, means that you are not able to reach what could be your most important allies, employees, and stakeholders. And so, what you're ending up doing is alienating people, not understanding where they're coming from, and not understanding your own role in perpetuating some of the biases that may exist. High cultural competency, on the other hand, does just the opposite, and it makes you excuse me, makes you a more engaged manager, makes you a better member of a team, and makes you more likely to achieve your ultimate practical and other types of outcomes. So, what you are looking for in this section is not necessarily whether you're a good person or a bad person. I want to say that from the outset. What you are looking for here, and with the Macintosh readings and ultimately the bias assignment that we're going to be doing, is how do I better understand my own role in the world, in this area, in my workplace, and how do I utilize that to motivate better decisions and outcomes? Also, how do I mitigate what I might bring negatively to a situation where power is not distributed equally? So, the first thing I had you do in this respect is to read Peggy McIntosh's The Invisible, this should be Invisible Knapsack, I put backpack here, but Invisible Knapsack. It's right there on the right side of the screen. And what I want you to think about when you're reading this and doing the inventory is the way in which privilege is usually so understated and accepted and built into our everyday lives, and that we don't examine it often enough. And in some ways, it's sad that privilege has become a backlash against buzzword. Well, I think it's good that we're talking about it more. I think perhaps the backlash has led us to automatically close off discussions about privilege when I think they are very important. They might not always be easy. Certainly, I think they can be quite difficult. But if we are to move ourselves up Maslow's hierarchy, and if we're to understand our own role in the world, I think that it's absolutely integral that we understand this notion of privilege and our own attachments to it. So I wanted to talk for a minute about privilege and understanding a little more closely. And the reason why it's important to examine, understand, and kind of continually update our knowledge on privilege is that we are often insulated from the types of stress that exist for people who do not have the same privileges as we do. This builds expectations for certain types of comfort that might not exist for others. It means that even a minimum amount of stress that is associated with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, etc., any type of minimal stress about that becomes sort of intolerable and we engage in defensiveness. So instead of thinking about privilege as bringing up a very narrow set of interests and a very disagreeable conversation, I think it's better to think of it as a tool by which we can kind of examine what privileges we have and engage in an honest conversation about them so that when we get into a situation, we've already started to de escalate the problem within ourselves. Because what we don't want to turn to is anger, fear, guilt. We don't want to engage in argumentation or silence or just leaving the situation to exist as it does, because that actually reinforces the power dynamics at play. And so, what we're talking about here is power dynamics and power systems. In power systems, we need to think about our role in them, but we also need to think about the fact that these are institutional power mechanisms. And because we typically are told to examine our own privilege, we look at privilege as very individual. I have certain types of privilege, and I will readily admit them. I have racial privilege. I have ethnic privilege. I have certain types of passing privilege for disability, sexual orientation for sure, and gender expression. And certainly I have educational privilege as well. But that doesn't make me a bad person, nor does it mean I should shed some of those things. I certainly wouldn't want to shed my education, for example. But I also need to understand the systems and social patterns at play here. So I thought this box to the right is very helpful for dismantling maybe this more defensive notion of privilege. Well, having privilege does not mean you are immune or free from struggle. I want to make that crystal clear right now. Um, Plenty of people struggle, and individual struggles can be very deep and meaningful, hurtful, and life changing experiences. It doesn't mean that if you have privilege, you are not a worthy person or that there are persons more worthy than you. This is not a commentary on your worthiness as an individual. It also does not mean you have not earned anything of your own right, that people should be willing to hand over things that they have worked towards. Um, but it also doesn't mean that you can't do more to engage with others in the world in a better and more productive way. So having privilege and having privilege means that you actually have an opportunity to change the power dynamic and to start examining your own role in it. So let's say you believe you understand your privilege. The understanding of your privilege is not a one-time deal. The fact is that privilege does not begin and end. It's not like you all of a sudden at age 25, 30, 35, 40, whatever, come to a realization that I have X, Y, and Z privileges, and therefore I need to understand them and move on. It's actually a never ending process because you always get more information about the world around you, and your own situation may, in fact, change. So, once you understand privilege, you can lead with empathy. And I think that's the most important thing here is that understanding your own individual experience and the fact that it is different from the experiences of others allows you to lead with empathy by understanding those experiences may differ. It makes you understand that privilege is very nuanced and can change over time, and therefore, someone who needs your services in the public sector may have different needs at different points in their lives. I think one of the biggest things it does, and I think we talked about this a moment ago, is that it reduces defensiveness to conversations about inequities based in race or gender or any of the other kind of privilege bearing power dynamics. And perhaps the most action based of them all is that it allows you to work to equalize power in situations where you may have it. And that might look different in different places, but there are ways in which, when you have power, you can negotiate the power dynamic for others. And I think that's extremely important to put into action. When you have a power dynamic where you're being paid more than someone else with equivalent education and experience, you can then lead the conversation about equalizing those things and raising the level of pay for another individual in a way that eases kind of the burden on them. That is one thing that your privilege grants you. And as a leader, that's especially important here because as a leader, you are especially tasked with eliminating power dynamics that can be harmful to the organization and can be harmful to your team. Because in order to move people up that hierarchy of self actualization, you need to actually have their trust and their best interests at heart. So, working to equalize those power dynamics is kind of the highest realization of this. So, the main takeaways here before we get to the bias and privilege analysis. The first is that motivating people means understanding their needs and responding to them in a way that gets them to perform at a higher level. This might mean things that are very job specific, whether it's job redesign, performance incentives, etc. But it also might be kind of understanding that they're coming to the world from a very different perspective than you are and knowing what to do about that. Leading means motivating and setting an example while also protecting those in your charge. So, by equalizing power dynamics where you can and moving to motivate people up that kind of ladder of self actualization, Maslow's hierarchy of motivation, you are engaging in work as a leader. Finally, being a culturally competent person rather, makes you a better leader, and arguably, I would say, is required to be even a good leader. Because if you do not understand the various privileges and disadvantages that exist around you, you are not able to adapt your work to the world around you. And more importantly, as public sector managers and people in the public sector, the public good should be the highest goal, and the public good really does mandate that we examine privilege and dismantle power inequities where we can. So, that leads us to the bias and privilege analysis. I want you to think about this as somewhere between a diary entry and a full fledged academic essay. It's a personal, reflective essay that explores the ways in which you have been challenged by the notions of bias and privilege personally and in the workplace. The kind of broad brushstrokes should take you about 2 pages. I don't need your life story. It can be longer, but try and keep it under 5 pages. But what I really want you to do for just a brief moment is to engage in an exploration of two kind of key and entangled concepts. The first is understanding that privilege is rooted in race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Um, how can you think about the way in which privilege interacts with your own life? And really being reflective about that in an open and honest way. It is, again, not a bad thing. It does not make you a bad person to have privilege, but I think it does make you a bad leader to not examine that privilege and see how it affects your daily life. And then the second part of that is, where can you work to better increase your own understanding of your privilege? And remember, privilege is nuanced. Just because you do not have privilege in one situation or in a certain normative way, meaning, maybe you have racial privilege, but you don't have gender privilege. Maybe you have sexual orientation privilege, but you don't have disability privilege, so on and so forth. Where can you work to better understand um, your privilege and use your privilege maybe for the betterment of society by lowering those power dynamics um, where necessary? Normal essay rules apply: double spaced, 1 inch margins, page numbers, appropriate grammar and spelling. I'll put a little caveat here. I realize that in most essays, especially if you've had me before, I'm really picky about not using first person I language, I, we, etc. Here, obviously, you have to break those rules, so go ahead and break them. You will turn it in via Blackboard. There will not be a separate assignment sheet for this. This is what I am giving you. It's a pretty broad assignment, and I expect you to take liberties with that as long as you're examining those concepts that are listed there and staying within that framework. I think you'll do well. And I wanted to make this, as opposed to a video submission, I wanted to make this a more personal essay for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that you are more likely to be honest about your privilege in a lot of ways if I'm the only other person reading it. Two is that I think maybe some self-reflection requires writing it down in a way that we don't normally do for the videos. But three is that I want you to have kind of a more concrete record of it so that you can work on these things over time. That's why it exists as an assignment in this course. I think it's absolutely imperative that we do this as human beings. But it's even more linked to your role as a public sector manager to engage in this type of work on an ongoing basis, because you cannot lead people, you cannot motivate people if you do not understand them. So eliminating or lowering your bias in certain situations, and understanding where you may be privileged, or where you may not be privileged is very important, very much rooted in your work, whether you like it or not, sadly. So let's face it head on together and engage in this little reflexive piece here where we're doing the work of becoming a better manager and, I would argue, a better person. All right, that is all for this week. I will talk to you later.